On a l'immense plaisir d'avoir avec nous le professeur François Crépeau, qui est Special Rapporteur au niveau des Nations Unies concernant la question des droits des travailleurs migrants. Je voudrais principalement et chaleureusement remercier le professeur François Crépeau qui a bien voulu être avec nous. Il faut savoir qu'il est en contact avec nous depuis Montréal, donc il vient en fait de commencer sa journée, puisque c'est encore la matinée.
C'est mon café.
Donc tout frais. et vraiment encore une fois, un énorme merci, puisque on connaît votre agenda. C'est pas forcément évident d'avoir la chance de vous avoir une après-midi entière. Merci énormément d'avoir pris ce temps d'être avec nous. On va s'intéresser cet après-midi à la question, on en a déjà parlé, et notamment lorsque vous avez, dans les sessions avec Richard, on a plusieurs fois mentionné la question des droits fondamentaux, des droits humains des travailleurs migrants. Et justement, avec le professeur Crépeau, nous allons s'intéresser à ces droits fondamentaux, mais aussi aux mythes qui entourent la question des travailleurs migrants. Pour des questions juste de pratique, je vous encourage le plus possible à envoyer, comme d'habitude, via le canal de Back Channel vos commentaires, que bien sûr, malheureusement, le professeur Crépeau ne les voit pas, mais je lui ferai part de vos commentaires au fur et à mesure de sa présentation. Professeur Crépeau, j'aurais juste besoin que vous me dites quand passer au prochain slide, puisque je ne suis pas sûre que ce soit coordonné depuis votre ordinateur. Donc, dites-moi simplement quand je dois passer au prochain slide.
Très bien.
Merci encore et je vous laisse tout de suite la parole.
Merci infiniment pour cette introduction. Je vais faire la présentation en anglais, mais je peux répondre à toute question en français, pas en arabe malheureusement, mais français ou anglais sont deux langues dans lesquelles je fonctionne très bien. Je vous remercie de m'avoir invité. Je vois que vous avez entendu déjà Richard Cholovinsky, qui était à Montréal il y a quelques semaines à mon invitation et avec qui j'ai eu de fréquents contacts dans les dernières années. La question des droits des migrants a pris beaucoup d'importance depuis, je dirais, 5-6 ans, et on pourra discuter tout à l'heure, peut-être dans la période de questions, pourquoi c'est si récent. Certainement, les droits des travailleurs migrants est quelque chose sur lequel l'OIT travaille depuis des décennies. Mais sur les droits des migrants proprement dit, il y a beaucoup moins de travail qui a été fait. Et mon mandat s'appelle le mandat du rapporteur spécial sur les droits de l'homme des migrants, Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. Donc je ne m'intéresse pas seulement aux travailleurs migrants, je m'intéresse à tous les migrants. And I will make this presentation in English. I have entitled, that is the first slide that you have with the boat and my name under it. I've entitled my presentation Between Myths and Crises, Rethinking Migration Policies. I've entitled that Between Myths and Crises because, as I'll explain, migration policy is very much shaped by myths, fantasies, threats, risks, and also through crises. And we've had an example of that with the Mediterranean situation in the past few weeks. It seems that it always takes a crisis to change something in the migration policy agendas at national level as well as at international level. So I'm going to go to the first slide, entitled Main Messages. That's the program of my presentation. I have 8 points, which are building into one another in order to achieve the demonstration that I'd like to achieve. And you see that the rights are all through this, although there's section 2, which is about migrants have rights, but rights will be discussed and thought through all through the presentation. So I'm moving now to the next slide, entitled We're All Migrants. The signpost, the road sign that you see at the back of this slide indicates caution, and you see a family, a man, a woman, and a child crossing the road. Usually it's animals crossing the road. You know, it's deers and moose in Canada. Here it's migrants. Why? Because this road sign is next to the Mexican-American border, and you have actually people running through the road, often at night, when the lights, when you can't see anything unless it's directly in front of your headlights. And there have been accidents. There have been people killed on that road. So that's why they have the sign. So it shows something about the social inscription of migration practices in regions, and especially in border regions. So I've said we're all migrants. This is a bit counterintuitive. It's a bit counterintuitive because we often think of ourselves as settled. We think of ourselves as settled because in the course of a generation, we, or at least in the past, we didn't change much our situation. We may have started to live in a different city from that of our parents, but very often we stayed in the same city during the course of our working life. And then we might retire somewhere else. But the idea of being settled is very much imprinted in our brains. Yet, we are born migrants. We all come from, it seems, so the archaeologists and geneticists tell us, we are all coming from the same woman. We're all descendants of one woman who lived 200,000 years ago in the Rift Valley in Eastern Africa. And we have conquered the world 10 times over since then. We've migrated from the Rift Valley to the Middle East, probably around 70,000 years ago. And then we've moved from the Middle East probably on the coasts to Asia, to India, and we've reached Australia 60,000 years ago. When the glaciers receded over Europe 40,000 years ago, we conquered Europe as well. And then, as you know, when also glaciers receded about 15,000 years ago, 17,000 years ago, we crossed the Bering Strait into America from Asia. And we conquered down to Tierra del Fuego at the bottom of the Americas. We've gone everywhere, and we've moved. And once we had conquered the whole planet, we moved considerably through the planet, constantly. In recent times, in older times, we've always done that. We consider ourselves settlers, settled, but we're not. We're moving. Even during the course of our lives, we're moving. And we're moving for our holidays, and we're moving for pilgrimages, and we're moving as expats, and we're moving for internships, and we're moving for our retirement. We're moving all the time. And there's a question that I'd like to ask you all, because it's often a test, and I won't be able to see the result very much because I only have a glimpse of your room, but you'll be able to assess for yourself. And the question is the following: who in this room lives in the city now, lives today, in this, not today in Torino, but lives where you work every day? Who in this room lives today in the city of birth of their 4 grandparents? Could you raise your hands, those of you who live today in the city of birth of your 4 grandparents? And I usually have a small proportion. I can't. Three, four, five. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, exactly.
So
3, 4, 5.
That's what I get. I get more hands in big cities like Paris or New York or London because there are many generations of Londoners and New Yorkers. But on a normal, with a normal audience, a representative audience, whatever that means, that's what I get. So most of us, and I include myself, most of us have an immigration experience in the past 2 generations. It may be from city to city, but sometimes within the same country, it's a different language, a different culture. It may be from one country to the neighboring country, but also, again, it might be a very different culture, different habits, etc. Or it may be transcontinental. In my case, there were several transcontinental movements in the past 2 generations. So we are migrants. That's my first point. It's in our DNA. We don't recognize this. We feel it's counterintuitive. We see migrants as others, and we have different words for different kinds of migrants. You know, expats are not migrants, although technically I don't see the difference. But there are some people we call expats and some people we call migrants. Migration is actually, in our history, 200,000 years, is a normal response to economic, political, and environmental challenges. That's what we've always done. If the clan or the tribe or the family grew too much, well, 2 or 3 subgroups of that clan, of that family, would move on the other side of the forest or on the other side of the hill or elsewhere or along the coast. That's what we did. And it's been, you know, long haul migration, short migrations, temporary migrations. Many of us were nomads for many, many generations. So what I want to say here is that migration is the rule and being settled is the anomaly. And that is counterintuitive. There are people that do not move. They have discovered a cave in Germany where there were 3 skeletons, which were dated back 3,000 years. And by curiosity, they asked the people in the neighboring villages to come in order for DNA testing, in order to see whether there were descendants of these 3 skeletons in the region of the cave. And they found one direct descendant of one of the skeletons in the cave within 20 kilometers of the cave. So there was one direct descendant 3,000 years later within 20 kilometers. So some people actually do not move much. There was a Shakespearean moment of this man holding the skull of his direct ancestor 3,000 years before, which was an interesting time. But that's the exception. The rule is that we move, we displace, we change place, we go elsewhere. And that really cannot be stopped. That cannot be stopped because that's what we've always done. That's how that's why we Europeans came to North America and South America. That's how Aboriginal peoples in North America moved constantly before the arrival of the Europeans. That's how Europeans moved constantly between different countries for short-term or long-term migration. This has always been, and in my mind, this will always be. Development and democracy differentials, the fact that the planet is not developed in a harmonious way, certainly is spurring migration. There is, as I mentioned, economic, political, and environmental threats and challenges all over the planet. And migration should be factored in as a normal adaptation mechanism. It is starting to be thought through in terms of sustainable development and in terms of climate change. But it's only starting to be thought through. We have to understand, and that is one of the key elements, we have to understand what is creating migration. What are the push and pull factors of migration? Main push factors being violence and poverty. Main pull factors being stability and economic opportunities, for sure. And then once we understand this and we can apply it to this or that situation, we have a better understanding of why people move, why it's not necessarily a crisis, and we can start dispelling the myths that I'll be talking about concerning that migration. I'm changing slide now. I'm going to the slide entitled Migrants Have Rights. So, this is also counterintuitive. Migrants have rights. If you ask many people in the streets, they will tell you, oh yes, they must have rights, but not the same as I have. I'm a citizen, I must have more rights. And that's an interesting issue. If we look at international human rights law, that's the two covenants, for example, and the Universal Declaration. But the Universal Declaration is more a statement of principles. If we take the two covenants, the law, international law, and we can see that in many constitutions as well, most of the fundamental rights enunciated are for everyone. Not everyone except migrants, or everyone except migrants and minorities, or everyone except migrants, minorities, and women. It's everyone. And this is important. There's two exceptions. There are two exceptions. In the, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and if I take my country, in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there are two exceptions. Only citizens have the right to vote and be elected, which is something that we might have to rethink in the future, but let's leave it at that for the moment. So only migrants, only citizens have the right to vote and be elected, and only citizens have the right to enter the country. So migrants have all the same fundamental rights as citizens, except those two specific rights. And that means, for example, that they benefit from the right to equality and the prohibition of discrimination. Prohibition of discrimination based on, for example, nationality or administrative status. They cannot be discriminated against because of their status as migrants. Now, discrimination in international human rights law is defined as a distinction that cannot be justified. There are many distinctions in our laws that can be justified. In the laws of our different countries, the right to vote is acquired at 18 or 20 or 21 in some cases. Well, this is a distinction. People who are under 18 cannot vote. Those who are above 18 can vote. It is a distinction. It is not a discrimination. It has been sent to the courts in several countries, and the courts have said, well, it's a reasonable distinction. It can be justified in a democratic society. For example, it's understandable. There are good reasons why people at 16 could not vote while people at 22 can vote. That's the issue. Now, if you take a distinction based on nationality, then you have to justify why only citizens should have access to this or that government service, for example, or this or that treatment. And there may be very good reasons. For example, foreigners do not have the right to a passport from the government of the country where they are. That's a distinction that is based on their status as foreigners, but it's acceptable. And so you see, it's possible to justify distinctions based on the status, but not all distinctions will be justifiable. To say, for example, that migrant workers who have worked for 2 decades in a country and have paid all the social benefits that they had to pay from their salary, etc., do not have a right to a pension when they have paid into the pension fund. That, in most countries, would be discrimination. They have done exactly the same as the other workers who are citizens. They have received a salary out of which the contributions for the pension fund have been taken. Why shouldn't they have the exact same right to derive a pension from that fund to which they contributed, like any other worker? And so that is where the distinctions and the prohibition of unjustifiable distinctions becomes discrimination, and equality has to come to play. So, in the end, what it means is that not every government services will be accessible to migrants. but most should if they are in the same conditions as other people benefiting from those government services. In terms of expulsion, for example, or detention, which is what many migrants fear the most, being expelled from the country or being detained in the country, and they fear that for good reasons, it's difficult to see how it would be applied to citizens. You know, you cannot be expelled from your country. That's one of the benefits of citizenship. And you cannot be detained because you're a migrant when you are a citizen. So that there's no comparison here, direct comparison between what a migrant will experience and what a citizen may experience. But at the same time, citizens are also detained for administrative reasons in other types of cases and for criminal law reasons as well, preventative detention in many cases. And that's where we can make the comparison. It's not because you are a foreigner that you can be detained at will. And in many countries, courts have intervened to tell the government, you can't detain just because you like it. For example, in Greece in 2012, the government announced that all irregular migrants would be automatically detained. Well, this is manifestly against international human rights law. Why? Because you cannot detain anyone and breach their right to personal freedom without a good reason. So what is the reason to detain the person? Well, for every one of us in this room, if we are going to suffer preventative detention, it's usually for two reasons. One, we're dangerous to the community. And there is reasons to believe that you're dangerous, that one is dangerous to the community. Or two, you are supposed to come back for further proceedings, and we have reasons to believe that you're not going to come back. You're going to disappear. And these are the only two reasons why you and I can be detained for preventatively before proceedings, administrative proceedings or criminal proceedings. Well, it shouldn't be different for migrants. If we have reasons to believe that they are dangerous or that they might not represent themselves to further proceedings, well, I understand why detention could be justified. But otherwise, it should not be justified. So in my mind, when Greece declared that there would be blanket mandatory detention of all irregular migrants that were apprehended, this was violating international human rights law because it was treating migrants very differently from other people in Greece for no justifiable reason. Many of the people whom I've seen detained were families with very young kids, babes in arms. These people are not very mobile. They're not going to hide very effectively, and they're certainly not dangerous. And putting kids in prison, in particular, is a contradiction of international human rights law. And it should be the same for labor standards. I mean, I'm sure you've discussed that extensively. Why should a migrant worker be treated differently than a citizen worker for wages, work conditions, health and safety consideration, contribution to pensions, etc., etc.? If you're a worker, and you should be treated as a worker under labor law. There should not be a difference in the way you're treated depending on your status. And yet, there are a number of differences, especially when the status is precarious. And we see that in many countries. We have to remember that the whole thrust of international human rights law is to individualize the situations. And if we apply it to women, for example, 70, 80, 90 years ago, in most countries, women could not open a bank account because there was an idea that they could not manage money effectively. Well, they fought. Some people in society should not have bank accounts. And it's possible to go to court to to ask for the court permission to prohibit a person from having bank accounts if the person is not able to manage his or her money. It's possible to do that if you have a good reason. being a woman is not a good reason. Being a foreigner is not a good reason. There's no direct connection between your status and the prohibition. And that is key. We should not treat migrants as a group. We should individualize the solutions in every time we are going to probably restrict a right of one migrant, or a group of migrants, we should ask ourselves, is this individualized? Am I taking this decision because this person has this or that characteristics? Or am I taking these decisions because I decide that all migrants should be treated the same? Like in the past, we used to say that, well, women can't vote, and women can't open bank accounts, and women can't drive, etc. So migrants have rights, and this is counterintuitive. I have had this experience 10 years ago. A top journalist of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, he had been war correspondent in Washington, in Paris, in London. I mean, he had seen the world, 30 years of career. And he was making a piece on irregular migrants in Montreal. And at one point in the conversation, I say that migrants have rights. They are covered by international human rights law and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, which is our constitutional human rights guarantee document. And he turns around and says, what do you mean they are covered by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom? I thought they were illegal. So this top journalist didn't get it, didn't understand that, like every one of us, we benefit from human rights, period. We are human beings benefiting from human rights anywhere in the world, and this should be respected by all the states where we find ourselves, be it our national state or not. And if there are restrictions on our rights, they should be individualized to our particular condition and to our particular situation, and not have blanket treatments. I'm changing slides again. Moving to the slide about irregular migration. You see here a US border guard in front of a train boxcar where irregular migrants have been found and arrested. Irregular migration is not a crime. That also is counterintuitive. In many countries and in many political discourses, irregular migrants are presented as criminals, and irregular migration is criminalized. We heard, for example, yesterday that Prime Minister Cameron in the UK wants to criminalize irregular work in the UK. So if you have a job and you're not authorized to have a job in the UK, you will be committing a crime. Well, that's the kind of thing that I think is absurd. Irregular migration is not a crime. It's a violation of administrative regulations which oblige us to go through a particular entry point for the territory and present appropriate documents, like a passport and a visa. There is an administrative regulation that tells us to do that. And when we don't do that, well, there's the violation of that administrative regulation. But it's not a crime. It's not a crime against persons. No one is hurt when someone enters the territory irregularly. There may be the commission of a crime on the occasion of that, but the fact of walking into the territory is not a crime against persons. It's not a crime against property. Nothing is broken. Nothing is stolen. And it's not a crime against the security of the state. 99.9% of irregular migrants present no security risk whatsoever. So there's no crime committed. No crime for which we can identify any victim. It's an administrative law violation, yes. And for that, there might be a small penalty, which, would be, but it's not a crime. And that is counterintuitive, again. And there is a tendency in the discourse of politicians and of the media to criminalize irregular migration. The language is criminalizing that we use is criminalizing. The institutions that we create, for example, border guards, who look nowadays in some countries like military personnel, this is criminalizing. The detention centers that we create for migrants look just like mid-security or maximum security prisons. That's criminalizing. So we criminalize in our policies and our discourse irregular migration, which is not a crime. This is the result of a trend that has been seen over the past 25 years, I would say, quarter century, of what political scientists have called the securitization of the public space. It's been noted by researchers that the states, and especially in the global north, the welfare states, which had established their legitimacy since the 30s on the welfare programs. And those welfare programs were sort of rolled back at the end of the 70s and during the 80s because of the oil shocks of the 70s. And suddenly the states had less legitimacy based on their on the welfare they provided to their citizens. So they reverted back to the basis of the legitimacy of all states throughout history since at least the Renaissance, and that is the security. And we have seen this securitization of the public space because nowadays we talk about water security, food security, energy security, environmental security, migration security, transport security. Everything has been securitized. Why? Because that...
May I just interrupt you 2
Yes.
seconds? Sorry, because we have quite an interesting comment on the back chain that was in fact related to the security aspect, where the person was asking if you have some information on the cost of detention, how much it costs to a state, to have this security approach on migration. So I just wanted to share this comment with you as you were talking about security approach.
I'll come to detention. Just to respond to that, the cost of detention is enormous. It's difficult to have figures in every country. It's difficult to have figures on migration generally. States do not compute their figures in the same way, and there's a big work that is being done at the UN, trying to push states into making migration statistics compatible so that we can compare one country with the next and have global statistics that make sense. At the moment, it's very difficult. So it's difficult to know the cost of detention. We know it's enormous, and it's really mind-boggling to see figure out why politicians can spend so much on the detention of people who are not dangerous, and we citizens and taxpayers don't say anything about that. We usually re-elect those people. And so there is an issue here. It's mind-boggling, and I'll come to that because that's part of the myths and the fantasies that are basing many of our migration policies. But just as an aside, the cost is enormous. And this is why, for example, Greece has gone back on its policy of arresting and detaining everyone, simply because it was unfeasible. First of all, they didn't have enough capacity to detain everyone, so they stopped detaining when the detention centers were full, which usually is not a good criteria for detaining or not detaining. And then it was costing them a bomb, which was useless. And so in the past 2 years, Italy and Greece have reduced the time of detention and have closed detention centers and have reduced the number of detention. Why? Because there's no reason to detain, except if you want to make it a political act that will count in your favor in the next electoral campaign. But if you're looking at public money, it doesn't make sense. So I'll come back to that a little bit later. And we are, that's the next point, we are using detention in many countries. We're using detention for migrants in a way that we would never think imaginable for citizens. Let's try to imagine if you had your daughter or your son being treated like most migrants, like many migrants are treated in our countries, we would be horrified. We would say, get out of there now, I'll pay your ticket. We would think it's not possible. We would not accept it for our own people. And yet we seem to accept it. As long as it's the others, we seem to be able to accept that quite easily. Now, what is interesting is that this criminalizing in the discourse, in the institutions, in the policies, in the wording of the policies that we use, does not translate, in most cases, by the use of criminal law. It's always administrative law. Why is that? First of all, because the obvious reason is that criminal law has too many constraints. Criminal law has been forever the most dangerous law of the land. Until not very long ago, it was the only law that could drive you to death, torture, and detention. Nowadays, and it has evolved over centuries, it has evolved a number of guarantees. The right to a fair trial, all the rules for the guarantees of the rights of the defense, access to the evidence, the rules of evidence and the rules of procedures in criminal trials have evolved to protect innocent people who would be accused falsely or wrongly, and in order to make sure that we only condemn those whom we are sure are criminals. And even then, we make judicial errors. Now, in administrative law, these rules don't apply. Administrative law was not a dangerous law, body of law, until recently. It was the body of law that governed construction permit, fishing permits, zoning laws, agricultural land, etc. It was not dangerous for our individual liberties. Nowadays, it has become dangerous. But the guarantees that we find in criminal law have not been imported into administrative law. You can be detained. I mean, the rule, for example, the basic rule of decision in administrative law is what is called balance of probabilities. If you think that there's 50% chances plus one that this is right rather than that, you can take the decision to go this way. In British criminal law, you have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the person is guilty. So that rule of evidence, that rule of evidence that you need, is not applicable in administrative law. In administrative law, you can use all sorts of elements of evidence. It's not evidence. You can use, for example, intelligence reports, which are not evidence because you cannot cross-examine the witnesses. There are very strict rules of what can count as evidence in criminal law. You don't have that in administrative law. It's much easier to use. You can detain people very quickly at will with very little oversight in administrative law. So it's interesting to see that there is criminalization in the discourse, in the institutions that we put in place, but we have managed to keep the administrative framework, which is much more convenient and allows the state to detain or to deal with migrants at will. And that is a contradiction which the courts have difficulty squaring. And we have to understand the push and pull factors on migration to understand why irregular migration happens. We often talk about the push factors, the fact that development policies have been partly unsuccessful over the past 60 years in many corners of the world. So there is a development issue, a poverty issue, and there's violence. And we have a refugee regime for that. And there's political upheaval in Syria and in different parts of the world. You have political upheaval, you have conflicts, you have people fleeing. So these are the two push factors that we can identify. But we rarely talk about the pull factors. Why do they come to the north? Or why do they go to South Africa or to Malaysia or to Indonesia? Well, because of stability, political stability, which responds to the violence that they might be fleeing, but also because we have jobs for them. Migrants are not stupid. They go where there are jobs. And we have jobs for them. And certainly in the global north, but also in countries like South Africa, Malaysia, Indonesia, there are plenty of jobs for migrants and for irregular migrants. We have allowed underground labor markets to develop in many sectors of our economies, which now rely on this subsidy to their competitiveness, that is irregular migrant labor. If I take the example of my country, I buy a little basket of strawberries next month in the market in Montreal, and it'll be $3. It doesn't make sense to buy strawberries at $3. Picking strawberries is actually very difficult. In June here, the day lasts 15, 16, 17 hours. So you work for 17 hours because that's when there's light. And you're on all four all day in the sun. There are no trees. And it's bug season, mosquitoes, black flies. It's very difficult to pick strawberries. And yet people are paid a minimal amount so that we can buy strawberries in the market in Montreal for $3 a little basket. It should cost $15. But then we would have all those strawberry farms in the north of Montreal that would go bankrupt. But we don't have any social conversation about this. And this is true for tomatoes in the south of Italy. It's true for extraction, fisheries in different parts of the world. It's true in many of sectors of our economy, in care, in hospitality, restaurants and hotels, in construction all over the world. Irregular migrants are employed in construction for next to no salary or very small salaries. I met agricultural workers from sub-Saharan Africa in southern Italy who were paid 20 euros for 10 hours of work in the fields. So it's 2 euros an hour. And that's when they were paid, because very often Mario didn't come to pay them at the end of the day. And there was no recourse. So we have jobs for them, and they come because of those jobs. We don't acknowledge that we have jobs for them because we don't want to talk about those underground labor markets. But there's a pull factor on which we could do something. Now, we hear someone like Mr. Cameron wanting to criminalize workers who take jobs. But if we think about it, they wouldn't come for those jobs if those jobs were not offered by employers. I mean, if no employer in Britain offered jobs to irregular migrants, there would be no irregular migrants in the UK. They would go to other places. So we have to change the mindset. We have to understand why people move in order to de-escalate this criminalization of the irregular migrants. Migrants, whether they flee violence or they are trying to flee poverty, are survivors. This is a survival migration. And in both cases, they try to do the best with the very little they have. And they often do it not even for themselves, but for their family, because they will send most of the money home anyway. And it's often an act of love. They do this because the family is not well, and they need to do something for their own family. And so criminalizing them is actually pretty stupid. It's pretty stupid because it's entrenching the underground labor markets. It's entrenching the smuggling rings. And it diminishes the capacity of those migrants to complain of the abuse they suffer. If we went after, for example, the employers and allowed migrants to complain against the abusive employers, we would know where the abuse happens and we could fight it and create a situation where the underground labor markets are reduced. But that's not what we do. And I'll come to that because it's important. And that means that states are at least co-responsible for the irregular migration movements. States are one of the key actors that create those irregular migration movements, because they create the conditions in which those migration movements are made possible. If you prevent people from coming, well, you create a market for smugglers. Immediately, there's a market for smugglers. And for example, the deaths that we've seen in the desert, Arizona desert, or the deaths we've seen in the Mediterranean, or the deaths we've seen in between Indonesia and Australia, or now in the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal, these are deaths that are created by the prohibition to enter. And by the activities of the smugglers, absolutely. But the market for the smugglers, which is an opportunistic industry, exists because of the prohibition. This is the lesson of history. In the 20s, the United States prohibited alcohol. It was called the Prohibition era. Al Capone and all these people were, high-level criminals at the time. Well, this was a market that was created for smugglers, and many Canadian families made a lot of money, bootlegging and smuggling alcohol into the U.S. And it took 10 years for the Americans to figure out that actually prohibiting alcohol was pretty stupid due to the consequences. It created a market for criminal gangs, and they reauthorized alcohol, and they legalized it, regulated it, and taxed it. That's the intelligent way of dealing with alcohol, for example. We are now starting to think about this after 40 years of the war on drugs. The war on drugs has been going on for 40 years. We have sunk billions of dollars into that war on drugs. And yet, the cartels and the mafias in the different parts of the world are as powerful and as deadly as ever. Look at Mexico. And now we're thinking, well, not smart. We should legalize, regulate, and tax. And California has started that. Utah, Uruguay, many countries are doing this. That works better. You reduce the you take over the market from the hands of the smugglers. And we are going to have to do this with migration. Remember, for example, in Europe, in the 50s and 60s, millions of Africans and Turks crossed into Europe. Millions. Into France, into Belgium, into Germany. No one died. There was no smuggling. Why? Because you took the ferry from Algiers or from Izmir and got into Europe. And there were visas and passports and currency control. There was no freedom of movement in Europe at the time. All people, you got controlled everywhere. But people could come and go. Same thing with the American-Mexican border. For decades, the border was easy to cross. People could come and go. There was no smuggling. So if we create a prohibition, we create a market for smugglers. If we're smart, we're going to discover that actually prohibiting doesn't work, and we have to create incentives for people to come to you. And that the best way of doing this is legalizing, regulating, and taxing. That's the smart way to regulate behaviors. And that's going to come. It's going to take time. Going from zero tolerance policies that do not work to harm reduction policies that actually do work. I'm changing slide here now. We have to understand that the precariousness in which many migrant workers find themselves is a construct. We create this precariousness. If you are an IT and you've been trained in a very high-level school in India or in China, you don't have any problem. All your migration issues will be dealt with by others, and you will be offered a green card here, a blue card there, or a very high-level visa, etc. You don't have problems. For most of the migrants on the planet, they are given only a precarious status. A status that creates anxiety, that creates a fear that the status could be withdrawn, that there might be a problem. And that fear is what conditions migrants to do what they're told and not protest and not contest. Because of the fear of being expelled, detained, the fear that their migration project, in which they have invested a lot, and very often in which the whole family and the whole village have invested a lot, will fail. And migrants don't want the failure of the migration project. And the precariousness is there to make sure that these migrants do whatever is asked from them, even if it's unreasonable, even if it's illegal. But they will not protest and will not contest. We have several sectors in which it's manifestly the case. In agriculture that I was mentioning, southern Italy, here in Canada we have tobacco industry, we have all the fruits, the small fruits industry, etc. It's manifestly in those industries that if you create a precariousness, sufficient precariousness, you will find migrants who will accept $3 an hour and not say anything. The migrants I met in southern Italy who were paid 20 euros for 10 hours of work could not protest, could not say anything. They just hoped they would be given the 20 euros because that's all they had for the past 5 days, and they were hoping to get them. You know, you create such precariousness that the very little you give appears like a boon. And to me, that is what we are responsible for. We create precariousness in order to extract value. This is what the barons of industry did in the 19th century. This is what unions were created to fight in the 19th century. And now we find ourselves in the 21st century with the exact same problem that the unions faced in 1880, 1890 in the industries created by the Industrial Revolution. So we create policies that shape the relationship between the employer and the employee. Employers are given such a control over the life of their employees that it becomes unreasonable. The fact that I visited Qatar, for example, 2 years ago, and many of under the kafala system, many migrants who are perfectly regular migrants. They have the visa, the work permit, and everything. But the employer can decide tomorrow to expel them. And that threat, and the migrants and the employer are very conscious of that threat. Not that all employers use it. Some employers are good and are not threatening their employees and are treating them well. But we are creating collectively through our policies the conditions that allow employers to abuse their employees. And we're not putting checks to that. In most countries, labor inspection simply doesn't work, or is too weak, or they're not well trained, or they don't speak the language of the workers. Many labor inspectors don't speak the language of the workers, cannot communicate with the migrant workers if they don't have interpreters, and they don't have enough budget to have interpreters with them. So they don't talk to workers, they only talk to the employers. So that's not good labor inspection system if we want to have labor regulations to be respected. The temporary migrant worker programs that we create embed precariousness into the status of the migrant. That's a problem. And unionization of migrant workers is either prohibited in many countries or is discouraged. We have had a case here in Canada where the unionization, the collective bargaining of migrant workers was deemed by a court not to be a right. Then other mechanisms than collective bargaining could be used in order to convey the wishes of the workers. Now, it happens that in the industry in question, the vast majority of workers are migrants. It's interesting to see that the courts will go back on international labor law, but for industries where it's migrant workers. So we are creating a situation of precariousness, and we don't acknowledge it. We don't accept it. Unions have long been hostile to migrant workers that they saw as competitors for citizens who were due-paying members. Unions have changed considerably in the past 10, 20 years and have begun to see migrant workers, precarious migrant workers, and even irregular migrant workers as future members or as present members, and certainly as people which resemble very much the people that they were created for a century and a half ago. People who are in a precarious situation, dominated by an employer who abuses their rights. And that's exactly what unions were created for in the first place. And nowadays, in many countries, unions are on board with the protection of the rights of migrants. But it has been a change in the past decades. I'm moving to the next slide. Yes, go ahead.
Can I just interrupt you 2 seconds, because we receive actually quite a lot of comments, and if it's fine with you, I will maybe share with you these comments.
Absolutely, go ahead.
So there is quite interesting comment on also, because we talk a lot about the employers, and so basically one participant is asking, what is your action as UN Rapporteur with the employers? What are the actions you are undertaking with employers? So that was one of the questions we had. Some comment also question on supply chain value, any programs for migrants, as that might be happening, for instance, regarding child labor. Do we have such kind of identical programs for migrants? Some comment quite also interesting, saying unions are now changing because more migrants are probably their future members. And last one, you were mentioning at one point what's happening in Italy. There were a question in Lampedusa, can we say that the people arriving, are they irregular migrants or are they asylum seekers, according to you? And very last, and I give you back the floor, what could be the key mechanism available for migrant workers when their rights are violated under international human rights law? So
okay.
That's basically the comments we received so far.
So just because I hadn't a piece of paper and I'm trying to take notes. The first one is about employers. What do I do with employers? Second is supply chain value.
Exactly.
Third is?
It was more a comment on union are actually now, trade unions are actually now changing because migrants are probably their future members.
Yeah.
And the last question was, no, they were actually, sorry, I also have another one.
Yeah.
So one in
There's Lampedusa. Lampedusa I've noted. What's the one before Lampedusa?
And then the key mechanism available for migrant workers when their rights are violated under an international human rights law. And the very last one, any figures or data of countries who are still criminalizing irregular migration. If any, how UN Human Rights Council address the said issue?
Okay. Employers. I have worked on occasion with employers. When I do country missions, I try to meet employer associations. For example, when I went to Sri Lanka, I met in particular with recruitment agencies who are proxies for employers in the Middle East. Very often, when I went to Qatar, I met with employer associations as well as recruitment agencies working in Qatar. So I'm trying to understand the other side, both sides of the equation, the reasons why this or that happens, the kind of self-regulating mechanisms that employer associations or recruitment agencies associations are trying to put in place. At the same time, I'm very conscious of the fact that whatever is put in place for employers is very, in terms of controlling the behavior of employers and the way they treat their employees, is in general, in most countries, pretty weak. And that abuse is possible, is made possible because of this weakness. We don't have enough oversight on people who have power. And this is not to say that all employers are bad employers. Not at all. In most countries, I would say, that I've visited, probably most employers are good employers. We don't know exactly because there's no complaint by the migrants in most countries. And I'll come to that. That's one of the questions you asked. But there is the possibility of abuse. Let's compare that to police violence. You've all followed probably what's happened in the past year in the United States with police violence, the police killing young black men. And you've seen the reactions, and you've seen the fact that the police was not prosecuted very often for those deaths, who may or may not be murders, we don't know, but they were not prosecuted. And you've seen that, for example, certain mayors have wanted to equip the police with cameras, permanent cameras, so that we would know what would happen. The idea is not that we single out policemen. The idea is to have oversight mechanisms which will allow us to know what's going on and to intervene. And this is what we don't have. Most policemen in the US are probably good guys or good girls. But they need oversight because they have power. In this case, they have a gun. And that's quite a lot of power over the life of people. And it's the same for employers. If you leave the power that employers have unchecked, without oversight mechanism, there will be a number of employers that will abuse. And often they will not even consider that abusive. Think about domestic workers and families. Many domestic workers live the life of the family, i.e., they wake up at 6 in the morning, like the rest of the family, and they go to bed at 11 at night, like the rest of the family. And they start working with the kids in the morning, and then there's the dishes, preparing meals, and then there's, and they go to bed after having finished the laundry and the dishes, etc. at 11. They have worked a 15, 17, 18-hour day of work. This is abuse. But in most families, many people would say it's not abuse. She's just living like we do. Well, for her, it's work. When for the family, it's family life. There's a big difference here that has to be understood. So this family is not, mean or criminal. They just don't understand that this is work and that they're an employer. It's not the family. So this is the kind of mindset that has to change. And we have to change in the general migrant workers' conditions, not simply for domestic workers, but in general. Employers have to understand that migrant workers should not be treated differently than citizens. It's not because migrant workers hesitate to complain that they should be worse off than citizens. And that comes to the question of what are the mechanisms for migrant workers to complain? Well, that's the problem. The problem is that migrants are silenced by the power that is exercised, by the power of the employer to denounce them and have them expelled or even detained before expulsion. As long as this threat hovers over the heads of the migrants don't contest decisions, don't protest, don't mobilize, don't unionize. Not that they don't have agency. Migrants in general exercise considerable agency. They make very courageous decisions for themselves and their families. They cross, many of them don't know how to swim, and they go on rickety boats that they can drown, and they know it. But they make those decisions very consciously. They exercise considerable agency, but they're very conscious of the threats that are hanging above their heads. And they're trying to make the best of the situation. The most frequent strategy for migrants is not to protest or contest or mobilize or unionize. It's to move on. You haven't been paid? Just don't say anything. Try to find another employer. Move on. That's what migrants do most. Why? Because they know that by sticking their neck out, they will be detected, and they might be detained, and they might be deported. And that's the end of the migration project. They're not there for that. They want the success of the migration project. They want to be able to send money home. Being detected, detained, deported kills the migration project. It's the last thing they want. And that's why employers and landlords have such power over those people. So there are actually very little mechanisms that are available to them that they will access easily. They will not go to court. They could. But access to justice is already difficult for you and I as citizens. For migrants, it's a non-starter. It's already, they don't speak the language, they don't know the laws, they fear lawyers. Migrants don't go to lawyers because lawyers have power, and many migrants believe that lawyers will denounce them, or that lawyers might exercise that power against them. And many lawyers are actually swindling their clients of money without doing anything, their migrant clients of money, without doing anything for them. And there's no way we can catch these people because often in our bar associations, the only way to catch a rogue lawyer is through the complaint mechanism. And migrants don't complain in official mechanisms. And so for bar associations like my own here in Canada, there's no problem because there's no complaint. So it's possible, for example, to write a letter to the special rapporteur. And considering the number of migrant workers who are abused around the world, I should be receiving millions of letters every year. And I don't. Because they know the limitations of my power. They don't even know I exist first. And then they know the limitations of my powers. But they also know that the mechanisms that exist in their country are very weak. I was in Greece in 2012. I met with the National Human Rights Commission of Greece in 2012, in the midst of the economic crisis. The National Human Rights Commission, which is there to protect the rights of everyone in Greece, including migrants, and could do a lot, at that time had no president, no vice president, and no budget. Period. Couldn't do anything. They had initiated all sorts of oversight mechanisms with the NGOs in the ports to make sure that there was no police violence against migrants. All this had folded down because they had no budget. They couldn't do anything. So even the mechanisms that could work don't work. That's where grassroots organizations, self-mobilization by small groups of migrants, and the help of the unions, when the unions are getting mobilized in favor of migrants, is so important, because unions can work under the radar screen, can help push negotiations, can talk to employers, can mobilize, can help. That's why unions are so important. But very often, unions on the ground are also very weak. And their first object, or the first priority, will be the due paying members. And very often those migrants are not even members of the union. Or there's no union in the field. Or how does a union access agricultural fields when the employer's militia is guarding the entrance of the property and preventing anyone from trespassing? So it's often very difficult for anyone to come to their help. Supply chain value, very important. When I was in Qatar, I was told by the head of the committee that is preparing the World Cup installations for the World Cup in 2022, I was told that they were going to put in place a mechanism of oversight of what the whole supply chain of the people who were going, of the businesses who were going to build the various installations for the World Cup would operate. And that would mean that they would do auditing mechanisms at all levels. So the company, the French or American company that got the contract for that stadium, and then the various subcontractors who have the different parts of the stadium, and the subcontractors who have the different parts of the different parts, down to the subcontractor that will provide 150 Nepali for one day to clean up the site, for example. And they were telling me that they were going to do auditing mechanisms at each level in order to make sure that the contracts were respected down to the one-day employee that came as an employee of a contracting company, which would be a subcontractor. So there is imagination out there in order to make that feasible. I haven't been able to check whether this has happened yet in Qatar. There have been recent reports, including Amnesty International this week, saying that Qatar actually is not going in the right direction. I'm not sure about that. I haven't checked on the ground. But there is imagination, and we could do that if we had political will. There's very, very little political will. And since migrants themselves are often not protesting, not putting pressure on politicians, there's no reason why politicians should do the right thing. I'll come to that. Lampedusa, are they asylum seekers or migrants? If we take the statistics of last year's Mare Nostrum operation, about 60% of them came from Syria and Eritrea. These people we know are refugees. We know that. They have been recognized in total for the Syrians in Sweden, for example, 90% of recognition rate of determination, positive determination rate in refugee status determination systems in Europe for Syrians and Eritreans. So that's a given. There's a 40% in Mare Nostrum who come from sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them are refugees, people coming from Boko Haram, Mali situations, or Darfur or South Sudan. So there are people who are coming and could be recognized as refugees, and there's a good part who are not, probably not victims of persecution or torture under the Convention Against Torture or the Convention on Refugees, but who are still survival migrants and who would go back to a very, very dire situation if they were to go back home. And they have suffered quite a lot en route. So if we term them economic migrant, we tend to think, oh, they have no protection problem. Well, they have protection problem. They have human rights protection problem, general human rights protection problem. They may not be refugees in the technical sense, but there might be many other, issues. Maybe they can't feed their family. Maybe several members of their family are dying of AIDS, and there's no money to buy any medication, and they've been sent away in order to send money home in order to save the lives of several members of the family. We don't know that. They need support as well, even if they don't need international protection under the Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees.
Sorry,
yeah.
I'll just interrupt you again because now I'm starting to get a lot of questions.
Yeah, and I haven't finished my presentation, but I love to be interrupted. So the presentation will continue as soon as I can. But that's okay. I love that. Good, continue.
So many questions. One I just received is, according to you, Professor Crépeau, what would you recommend to replace the kafala system in many GCC countries? And this is coming from one of our participants from Bahrain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the ILO has provided over the last 94 years a pretty good legal framework for protecting the rights of workers generally. And I think that is what should happen around the world in all countries. This includes unionization, this includes collective bargaining, etc. Now, I know that for some countries are starting very far from that model. And so it'll take some time before they get there. But this is the only way to ensure that workers generally, migrant workers in particular, are being protected and that their labor rights as well as their human rights are actually protected. And in my last slide, I have this, and I'll come to it later, but I can mention here the issue. What is important in human rights generally is that we hear the voice of the individual. That's the whole thrust of the doctrine of human rights, is about hearing the individual against the system. It's the little guy, the little person, who can fight the system by saying, you're trampling my right, you have no right to do this. This was, if we take history, this was what habeas corpus was in the 14th century England. It was the capacity of one person who had been put in detention to call on the king to say, why am I detained? I shouldn't be detained. Please check that my detention is illegal and get me out of here. The little guy. Same thing in international labor law. It's about the individual employee being able to tell the employer, please don't do this. This violates my rights. In order for that to happen, this little guy, this worker, must not fear retribution. And for that, there must be a balance of power between employees and employers. And that's what unionization has been created for. That's what collective bargaining has been created for. That's what all the mechanisms of labor law, the adjudication mechanisms of labor law have been created for. It's to create a balance of power. Otherwise, we have an employer that enjoys a position of domination and can do whatever he or she pleases. And that's the problem. So I would say for the GCC countries, the first elements of, and I'm not talking GCC countries, what I've said in my report on Qatar, and I'll talk only about Qatar because I've studied the situation and I've written a report on Qatar. What I've recommended in my report is that the kafala system should be first transformed and in the future abandoned because it doesn't correspond to what workers need today. Elements of the kafala system should be abandoned immediately. The capacity of the employer to declare any employee runaway, which creates them immediately as irregular migrants who can be arrested and detained. The employer should not be able to do that. That's not for the employer to do. The fact that you're connected only to one employer under the kafala system, and not simply the kafala system in the GCC countries. In Canada, we have temporary migrant worker programs which are based on the idea that you have a visa only for working with one employer. If this employer fires you, you're out of the country because you've lost the reason for the visa. To me, this is giving too much power to the employer. And we should not have that. What is recommended in Canada is to have, is to have sector-based visas. So you have a sector-based visa, you can work in agriculture. And if one employer in this agricultural sector abuses you, you can move to another employer without asking permission, as long as you stay in your sector. That gives you power against the employer. Otherwise, if you're linked to only one employer, the employer knows that as soon as you are, unhappy with your situation, the employer can threaten you with firing you, and that means expulsion. And that silences the worker. So this power of the employer must be curbed in order for abuse to be reduced. And so I've made in the report to Qatar a number of proposals that should be implemented immediately, and then transformation over time so that the Qatari economy can adapt, and we can get to a situation where migrants have enough power to be able to fight abuse, which is not necessarily the case of all businesses and all employers, but which is when you create conditions where abuse is possible, a large proportion of employers will come to see as normal to abuse the employees. Why? Because of competitiveness. If they start giving better conditions, there's a cost to it. But if the other employers do not have that cost, they're losing competitiveness. And that's where the state has to intervene, to have a level playing field, making sure that employers respect all the rules of labor law in a level playing field so that there's no competitiveness issue between them. They all respect labor law, therefore they have all the same costs of labor. But those costs have to increase. So that was my answer to this question. There was the role of unions in the future. I think I've talked enough about that. There was the last question you had asked about criminalization. What was it? I've noted criminalization, but I don't remember exactly how you had framed that.
Let me just find the question again. Yes, any figures or data of countries who are still criminalizing irregular migration? If any, how UN Human Rights Council address the said issue?
the Council doesn't really address the issue apart from saying that criminalization of irregular migration is not a good thing. There has been a few resolutions on that. But data is very difficult to come by on migration issues generally. Italy has criminalized irregular migration for a number of years and then has stopped. Last year, they decriminalized irregular migration because it wasn't serving any purpose. It was bringing people into prisons uselessly, and it was not deterring anyone, and it was not doing anything good. It was useless, and it was even counterproductive. So it's difficult to have figures on criminalization. It's difficult to see the cost of criminalization because it's often not distinguished on whether you're a migrant or not. For example, you're fighting smuggling and you're arresting smugglers. Now, there may be foreign smugglers, there may be local smugglers. In criminal law statistics, they're not distinguished. So you don't know whether these are foreigners or citizens. Same for employers who are abusing their employees. Many of them could be foreigners, some of them could be citizens. We don't know. We often don't know the nationality of the employer. So it's difficult to come by. Those statistics are difficult to get. But there are countries that are heavily criminalizing, more in Asia, some in Africa, irregular migration. But then again, statistics are difficult to come by. I think I've answered most of the questions for the moment. If I can continue with this slide that I have about irresponsible political discourses, because this explains some of the why this is possible. Why is it that employers and smugglers and landlords and recruiters are exploiting these people on a massive scale around the globe, and we don't hear much about it? We hear it when people die in the Mediterranean, but even when people don't die in the Mediterranean, you have millions, tens of millions of people who are being exploited and abused around the world, and we're not listening to that. So why is that? And I would say one of the elements of answer is about the way that the political field is being organized. We have seen, especially in the global north, but it's also true everywhere in the global south, that anti-immigration discourses have been normalized. We have heard very strong anti-immigration discourse. We have seen political parties, nationalist, populist political parties pop up here and there everywhere, saying that migrants are the cause of every ills in society. Now, why is that? And I will talk essentially about the global north here and about electoral democracies to show why. But this is true in non-democracies as well. The issue with democracies is that, and democracies is arguably probably the best system that we have collectively invented in order to govern ourselves. You know, the government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's probably the most sophisticated mechanism we've invented in order to arbitrate between the interests of the whole population. And this goes through an election where everyone has a vote. Now, the issue is that it's not everyone. For a long time, it was only males. Before that, it was only males who had no debt and had property. And then it was every male. And then we added women. But then we noticed that some communities were never participating in the vote because they didn't think that the vote would change anything in their lives. And so we want now to have active participation. Problem is that electoral democracies function with politicians paying attention to issues where they can gain votes. Electoral democracies function through electoral incentives. When women became citizens in the full sense and got the right to vote, they fought very hard in the past 60 years, let's say, in order to changed the conceptions of political parties. They became members of political parties, tried to have the party adopt a platform that included women's issues. Then they wanted to be elected, and then they wanted to be ministers and prime ministers and president of the republic, and they changed the political discourse. Today, in many countries in the global north, if a male politician does a sexist joke, it may be tarnishing seriously his political image, and it may kill his political career. This is a stupid thing to do nowadays. Why? Because women have fought hard to make men understand that there would be political, electoral consequences to being stupidly sexist. This is exactly what other categories of population have done. Gays and lesbians, for example, in recent years have come out of the closet, and they have exercised their rights as citizens in order to be treated equally with other citizens. And there is an electoral reward because they represent a significant number of votes, and political parties and politicians have paid attention. Same thing for Aboriginals in countries like mine or Australia. Same thing for minorities in many countries. Same thing for detainees. I mean, many categories, marginalized categories of people have come to the politicians saying, change your discourse, change your minds, and we'll bring you votes. Now, this is not going to happen for migrants. They don't vote. They're not elected. And we see in many countries that the anti-immigration discourse is not a left-right divide. If you go to the UK these days, Cameron and the Labour Party say about the same thing. I mean, the policies of Cameron at present are the continuation of those that were started by Tony Blair of the Labour Party 15 years ago. If you go to France, Valls and Sarkozy have the same policy. If you go to Australia, the Liberals in power now, with Tony Abbott, have continued the policy of Labour, which had continued the policy of the Liberals before that, of John Howard. I mean, why? Because migrants don't count politically and electorally. And there's no reward to doing anything good for migrants. There's a big disadvantage of speaking up in favor of migrants, because then you're attacked by the nationalist populist parties who have actually defined the terms of the debate for the past 30 years. When Jean-Marie Le Pen said 30 years ago, 2 million immigrants, 2 million unemployed, he created an equation that said that migrants steal jobs from citizens. And many people still believe that, because migrants have not spoken up and have not been able to demonstrate that this is a stereotype, that this is a fantasy, a myth, like women have been able to demonstrate over 60 years that it was a myth that they didn't know how to drive, that they didn't know how to be CEO, that they couldn't do politics. Women have intervened in the political debate. Migrants don't. They don't because they fear sticking their neck out. They fear being detected, because that means, for many of them who are in a precarious situation, detention and deportation. They won't do that. So we have a situation where actually we have myths, stereotypes, fantasies going around the political stage without being checked. Migrants steal jobs. Migrants bring illnesses. Migrants are a security risk. Migrants create insecurity at local level. Migrants are changing our culture. Migrants want to change our habits and our culture. These are myths and stereotypes. This is not true. This doesn't happen. Cultures change over time, all the time, but not specifically about migration. Just because I, at 55, I don't have the same values as my father, who's 85, who would be 89 if he was with us. Generations pass, generations change. Values can stay relatively the same, but the modes of expressions of those values will change over time, not because specifically of migration, but because we are changing. We are not the same people as we were 30 years ago. So this is, to me, a very important element to consider. Migrants today are like the poor in the 19th century. They were not part of the electoral debate. And therefore, policies about the poor, like the poorhouse and the poor laws of the 18th century, were taken by rich people about poor people, and those rich people had absolutely no knowledge of what the life of a poor person was. Today, we citizens are making laws about immigrants, and we have collectively no idea of what the life of an immigrant is. If you remember the slogan of persons with disabilities, which is, "Nothing about us without us." Well, this is exactly what we do. We always do laws about migrants without consulting migrants, without any debates with migrants. And that, to me, is a major issue for us in order to try to change the stereotypes, trying to change the policies about migration. As long as migrants won't speak up, or we citizens won't speak up about migrants, stereotypes, fantasies, myths will continue to abound. And this is particularly interesting, for example, in the language we use about migrants. It's what I call a liquid language. It's always about migration flows, waves, tsunamis, migrants trickling through the border. It's a liquid language. I don't even apologize for making wild anthropological analysis for which I'm absolutely not qualified. But to me, I would interpret this, the type of language we use about migrants, because water is a threatening mass. Water is one big mass. Imagine a tsunami. It's one big mass that comes towards you. And that's what we want to see. That's how we portray migrants. One big threatening mass. No individuality. In fact, if you ask people if there are too many immigrants in the country, many people will say, or too many Muslims, for example, if you take countries in the north, you will ask the question, are there too many Muslims in this country? And the majority of the population might say, oh yes, too many Muslims. And so you tell them, so Mohammed here, who is the grocery store owner at the corner, should go back home. And they say, oh, no, not him. We know him. He's a good guy. He should stay. What does that tell us? That tells us that as long as you consider the people as a big mass with no individuality, well, it's threatening. If you start to consider the individualities, if you start considering the individuals, well, it's much less threatening because you know them, you understand who they are. That's exactly what men felt about women entering the political world. Those women were going to wreak havoc on the political world if they had the right to vote and become politicians, because they are so emotional, etc. Those are myths. But suddenly we started to understand that women were not one big mass. They were individuals. Some of those women don't know how to drive, that's true. But some men don't know how to drive. Some of those women are pretty powerful. Lady Thatcher. She didn't seem very emotional. And we started individualizing. And that's what human rights is all about. Changing those words that we use, changing those conceptions that we have, and recognize that migrants are all individuals just like we are. They have parents, they have children, they have done degrees, some have done schooling, some have done university. They have all sorts of abilities, they have dreams, they have invested a lot, they have made terrible decisions, they've been arrested, detained, they've come back. They have lives just like we have lives, and their lives are as individual as our lives are. And so that is something that we have to come back to. An irregular migrant is not just illegal. In many countries we want to say irregular migrants, they are illegals, therefore they should go back home. Well, if we look at the individuality, we see that this illegality is only a very tiny aspect of their personality. They have been employed for the same employer for the past 10 years. This employer actually liked them. They have been married in the country. They have kids going to school who speaks perfect French or perfect Italian or perfect whatever. It's not the illegality that defines them. The illegality is one element of a vast array of criteria that we can use, that they can use to identify themselves. They may be an artist. They may be a marathon runner. We don't know that. And that's what human rights tells us. We have to think of them as individuals, like we did for gays and lesbians. Gays and lesbians are not necessarily defined by their sexual orientation. They may be artists. They may be many other things that is, as important for them as their sexual orientation. Like the fact that I'm straight doesn't define me as, generally. I'm many other things. I'm a professor, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm not doing enough sports. There's all sorts of things that define me. And it's true for migrants. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. I mean, you were talking about liquids, so I would like, in fact, to say that I would propose that we let the flow going on because there are many questions. If you don't mind, and I apologize again for the interpreters, I would like maybe, to open the floor. There is so many questions, and I would like also, that maybe we only have 40 minutes, and I would like maybe, to open the floor to the participants so they have the chance also to ask directly their questions to you. Yeah. I know that you still have some slides.
I have 3 more slides, but it doesn't matter if I don't get there,
Yeah, okay. So I would say, they have the chance to exchange with you. If you don't mind, I would prefer if you to have, an open discussion with the
Absolutely. That's good with
people.
Me.
So I still had one question that I will ask you, and then I will open the floors for you have the mic on the table. One question that was, in fact, more than a question, was a comment from one participants from GCC countries say that in the kafala system, the employer needs to pay around $3,000 for domestic workers. So how will free mobility and work and elimination of kafala system benefit to the employer too? So this is one of the questions I get. There is another one. Again, on if you have recent example how, in certain country, they change the legislation, taking into consideration the international labor migration standard. So if you have recent example of country which adjust their national legislation, I will right now open the floor to ask some participants if they want directly to ask the questions to Professor Crépeau. So I have one question here okay, so I would start there. I would just kindly ask you, when you take the floor, please just your name and where you're coming from, okay? The floor is yours.
Hello, I'm Cynthia. I'm from Brazil. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. It's really inspiring and also worrying when we listen to you because I think pretty much many countries look up to Canada when it comes to migrant standards, the treatment to migrants' rights. So thank you for your passion about it. I was wondering, you in your presentation you were talking about mythbusters, right? That it's also something that you do a lot to attack the myths behind migration. And I was wondering if we as people involved in the topic, so hopefully and supposedly from a human rights perspective, if we're not just being too reactive and not too much proactive when it comes to advocating and, as you just did right now, bringing this human dimension, this individual dimension. So is there not enough research on the positive aspects of migration when it comes to economic aspects, I don't know, cultural, everybody loves to go to Toronto and eat all kinds of food. So should we promote more positive research on these aspects? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take 2 additional questions, give you the floor, and then returning to the audience. I have one question here on my left. Yes?
Myself. Yes. So, good afternoon, Professor. My name is Mr. Hussein, and I work for COMESA. That's Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and I'm based in Zambia.
Zambia.
So, yeah, Zambia. My question is, working in a regional organization, we have so many protocols on free movement. And the problem we are facing is we don't have, our member state don't implement fully this protocol on free movement. And this protocol, some of them foreseen, for example, the free movement of labor, skilled labor, or something like that. So when we ask our member state why they are not implementing the protocol, after all, is the ones who adopted this protocol, they are saying that, our economy are not strong, and we are fear that the immigrant, or the people who are coming from other countries, take the job of the national. While the specialist in immigration will tell you that the migrant doesn't take the job of the national, but fill the gap. Yeah. Is it true, Professor, that the migrant doesn't take the national jobs, the job for the national? Yeah. That's my question. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you. And the last questions?
Monsieur Crépeau. I'm Rada Jabour from Lebanon. We have met last year. I work for CAFA organization. I have two questions related to migrant domestic workers. The first one is about the recruitment fees that are paid at the same time by migrant domestic workers coming to Lebanon and by employers, Lebanese employers. They actually pay the same fees, so there's clearly a fraud and an abuse of domestic workers. My question is, every time we bring up the issue of high fees, high recruitment fees that are unexplained and they're like really huge fees, the answer of the government is to say that we live in a free country, in a free market, and there's no way we can put a ceiling or a limitation to the profits of private recruitment agencies. So this is against the free and liberal thinking. So according to your experience, is it something that we can ask for? So, do some countries put a ceiling or a limitation to the profit of agencies? Second question is related to the government-to-government recruitment. In Lebanon, we're trying, at least for CAFA, we're trying to push for a government-to-government recruitment and call for a minimum intervention of private recruitment agencies. Yeah. According to your experience, is that a model that works? And is it realistic to plan for the disappearance of private recruitment agencies? Is it something realistic to ask or to plan for?
Yeah. Okay. Good. So you want me to respond to all those questions?
Yes, please, and I will take
how many hours do we have?
Question after.
Okay.
You just start your day.
Let's start with the kafala system. I've heard that argument that employers pay $3,000 for domestic workers, and then the domestic worker can go, and so they will lose the $3,000. Well, to me, that is precisely the point. If we have a sector-based visa instead of an employer-based visa, the employee can go if the conditions are not good. And it is precisely the idea that we should put the employers in competition for the employees so that the employees can leave an abusive employer and go for a better employer. And then better employers will have a retention of their employees, a retention rate much higher than bad employers. And bad employers will be driven out of the market. That's what we do all the time. In labor markets that are not isolated by a system which creates precariousness. If an employee is, if you're a doctor and you work for a hospital and you're not satisfied with the way the hospital is treating you, because your salary has been cut, your hours of practice have been cut, and you had a room in which you could sleep, and it's been taken away. I mean, you're going to say, I'm going to find another hospital to work with. And too bad that, they wanted me for the next 5 years. I'm going to move on. And that's what we all should do. If I'm not happy in my university, I'm trying to find another job in another university. That's exactly what should happen. And that gives power to the employee. And there's often a reason why employees will go. It's because the conditions they are working in are not good. And we should let them do that. And if that means a loss of $3,000 for the employers, well, it's for them to change their behavior, not for the employee. Employees, especially migrant workers, if they're treated well and they can send money home, will often try to stay with the same employer for as long as possible, because this is security for them. They don't have much security in their life, but if they have a good employer, that's security, and they will stay with that employer. If the employer is abusive, if the domestic worker, for example, is given, half a day of holiday every week, for example, very often the domestic worker, and that's a big, for example, that's a big issue, but it's not an issue simply in the kafala system. It's an issue in Canada about domestic workers as well. The family has a domestic worker, and they say, we're going on holidays, and actually we need you to take care of the kids during the holidays, and we'll pay for your holidays with us. And that family is thinking, aren't we generous? We're offering her holidays. Well, that's not holidays for her. That's work. And very often families don't think that. They're going to the beach. Everyone is on the beach, including the migrant worker with the children, and they think this is holidays. Well, that's not holidays for the migrant worker. Her holidays, she wants to pass with her children in her country of origin, or her family elsewhere in another neighboring country. That would be holidays for her. But families don't see that. And that's why we have to change the minds of the families. Domestic workers should have reasonable hours of work, should have reasonable days of holidays, should have reasonable annual holidays, and should have holidays during the, for example, during the religious festivals in the country. They should also have holidays, maybe not on the day of the religious festival, especially if the family they live with receives the rest of the family, but that means that should be compensated by another day of holiday somewhere else sometime else during the week. So it's changing the mentality. Personally, if the employer is abusive, I will not cry that they lose their $3,000. Certainly not. What we need is a market where people can move, where people are mobile, so that they can choose which employer they're going to work with, and so that the employer will be careful about the way they treat the employee, because they know the employee can go. And so they will try to make the employee happy. At the same time, the domestic worker would like to keep this job, because leaving this job is getting into a lot of insecurity, and it's not easy for them. So they will also try to negotiate with the employer in order to make the employer happy. But it's this balance of power which will create the best situation, the situation that is most conducive to actually the domestic worker giving the work its value, but not being abused. So to me, that's a very important thing. It's not about the $3,000 of the employer. It's about making sure that there is negotiating room so that both can see eye to eye, one giving the work, one paying, and they can tell each other, okay, I'm paying you, so you work for me. But I know you can leave, so I'm trying to find a way that you're happy and I'm happy. To me, that's very important. What legislation has changed? It's difficult. In many countries, the legislation is actually good. In Qatar, as in Canada, recruitment fees paid by the migrant worker are prohibited. And in Qatar, as in Canada, if you interview migrant workers, they have all paid recruitment fees. Every one of them. In Canada and in Qatar. So it's not the legislation. It's the implementation that is problematic very often. In Qatar, there is a population of almost 2 million migrant workers. And when I visited, there were 150 labor inspectors for the whole country, who were all themselves migrant workers on a one-year contract, renewable. They were all themselves migrant workers. Now, can you expect migrant workers to go into businesses owned by citizens and started criticizing the way those citizens are treating their migrant workers? There's an issue of balance of power here. On top of it, most of these labor inspectors didn't speak the language of most of the workers. Most of the workers in Qatar are Indian or Nepali. And that's not the majority nationalities of the labor inspectors. So you had a situation in Qatar where the labor inspectors actually never talked to the workers. They went into a business, a construction site, and they went to the employer's office and went through the books, never talking to the employees, who never had any way of communicating with them. How do you ensure the implementation of labor law if the employees have no way of talking to the labor inspectors? So, the labor inspection system is good. It's on the books. It exists in the legislation, etc. But it's not adequate. It should be reformed. That was in my report to Qatar. And that is true of most countries. Labor inspections in Canada are not much better. A bit better, but not much better. The raids on companies that abuse migrant workers are usually announced in advance. So when the labor inspectors arrive in the company, well, there's no migrant worker to be seen, because the employer has said to the migrant workers, stay home today. The inspectors are coming. We don't want to see you. So there's no one to talk to. So it's the legislation is often good. It's the political will to implement it that is absent, especially when the migrants themselves will not protest or contest. The two questions following, the question from, and I'm sorry I didn't catch really your names, but Brazil and Zambia, were both about myths and representations. Generally, the positive aspects of migration, that was the Brazilian question, if I may, and the fact that migrants take jobs and the economy is not strong enough, that was the Zambian question. And the research is out there. The research has been done over the past 30 years by economists and by sociologists and by anthropologists. Most of the myths about migrants are wrong. For example, migrants take jobs. Well, all the research I've seen, and I've seen quite a lot, say that that's not true. It's true for small pockets of jobs, usually at the bottom of the labor market, in already very precarious elements. For example, if you have very small little shops in that are very precarious. It's a little cabin, and they sell only a few things. But these are household things that the families around might need from time to time. Well, it happens that those shops, which could be staffed with citizens, could be replaced or could be displaced by a shop that is going to open nearby with a migrant who has another type of network in order to supply goods at a lower price, and who is, for example, willing to work longer hours and to be open very early in the morning when people go to work, or very late in the evening where people come back to work. And so Yeah, yes, in those small pockets, already very precarious, you may have some replacement of citizens by migrants. But this is the small exception. In most cases, migrants, as you mentioned, fill the gaps or create their own business or allow the employer to expand the workforce. And so all the studies are saying is that what is most important is not that migrants are there to fill the gaps, it's that people are mobile. It's the mobility which is the issue. For example, in most of our countries, we are favoring mobility. If there are no jobs in Montreal, the Canadian government wants those Montrealers who don't have work to find work in Toronto or Calgary or Vancouver. And if suddenly the oil prices fall down, as they have recently, and Calgary is in the midst of a crisis because half of its economy is about oil, well, they want people who are working in Calgary and have lost their jobs to go to Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. That's what we all want. That's how the economy works. Migrants do that. Migrants do that all the time. They are absolutely mobile. And that's their force. And that's where they fill the gaps, where citizens are less mobile. And that's been covered by economists. They can show that absolutely. Migrants will go where there's a job, will go where there's a possibility of opening a little store. They will find the place. They are mobile. For example, it's quite extraordinary to see the anti-immigration discourse in the UK, and especially against Central Europeans. It's quite extraordinary because if you think of it, when the European Union was enlarged in 2005, the UK was one of a very small number of countries that opened its borders immediately to these people. Other countries placed a 7-year transitory period before admitting these people into their labor market. But the UK opened its borders, and it welcomed 1.5 million Central Europeans over the next few years. If you were in a pub in Dublin, in Ireland, in 2007-8, every single staff of the pub had a Central European accent. They came and they worked. And there were jobs. The economy was booming. And suddenly came the crisis in 2009. And what's extraordinary is that almost 1 million of them left the UK when they lost their jobs. So the unemployment figures remained relatively flat. That's what mobility does. Now, many Brits who lose their jobs do not leave the country. They stay in England in order to find another job in England. What migrants provide is this mobility, which is an advantage. So the question about the research on positive aspects to migration is that the research is out there. The research about diversity, the boons of diversity, the research about mobility, it's out there. But it doesn't come into the conversation because politicians have no interest of bringing it into the conversation. The only exception that confirms what I'm saying, actually, is the United States. Because in the United States, you have 11 million undocumented migrants, 8 or 9 million of whom are Mexicans. But you have between 30 and 40 million Mexican Americans, American citizens of Mexican descent. And they actually care for the other Mexicans who are ill-treated in the US. So there is an electoral advantage. And Obama has won 75% of the Latino vote in the last election. And that's one of the reasons why he won. And that's what, in the next presidential election, might be the failure of the Republican Party if they don't gain back part of that Latino vote. So in the US, because there is an electoral advantage, suddenly they're interested. And what is interesting is that suddenly in the debate between those who are against immigration and the Obama administration that has been trying to regularize several millions of those migrants, in that debate, suddenly social science comes up. And you have research made by the Pew Institute and research made by the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, which comes up in the debate, comes up in the media, comes up in the language of the politician, saying, you see, there's no problem. They're actually helping our economy. Why don't you want them? Suddenly this social science is made use of. When if you see the landscape in countries like France or the UK or Australia, very often the social science doesn't come up in those very heated political debates because it's not about science. It's about myths and fantasies that we can't dispel because there's no electoral advantage to do so. When people will tell you that the economy is not strong enough to, for all those migrants who will take jobs, this is a fantasy. Social science has demonstrated that 10 times over. But how do you change the mind of a politician who's been winning elections saying that for the past 2 or 3 elections? Here we have a problem. Lebanon, recruitment fees. I don't have a magic bullet. Recruitment fees are prohibited everywhere. Almost everywhere, not everywhere, almost everywhere. They should not be paid by the migrants. That's in the normal scale of things. They should be paid by the employer. And they should not be extraordinarily high, but they should be sufficiently high. And, it should not be passed on to the migrants. That's what normal practice should be. It's not that almost anywhere that I know of. Even in Canada, I mean, we had a minister of immigration who was incensed 5 or 6 years ago because he had discovered that Chinese immigrants who came to work in the mining industry in Canada had paid recruitment fees, and he had prohibited that. But if you interview migrants, they all have paid recruitment fees. They just don't talk about it. It's the condition for getting the job. So for them, it's an investment. They get the job because they have paid the recruitment fees, so they get the job. So then they have to repay the recruitment fees because they have borrowed, for example, to pay the recruitment fees, and they have to repay their debt. And for them, it's an investment because as soon as the debt is repaid, then they can send money home for other stuff. And so they don't talk about it. It's just part of normal life. They don't protest, even though they have the right to protest, because in Canada, recruitment fees are prohibited. So how to change that? I made a proposal and that goes to your government-to-government proposal or question. In my report to Qatar, since Qatar is so interested in e-government, and that was very impressive, e-government in Qatar has been developed quite considerably. Everything can be found online. You can fill forms online. You can obtain all sorts of things from the Qatari government's, Qatari authorities online. Everything is online. It's very well organized. And I suggested in my report, why doesn't Qatar open a labor office in Kathmandu, for example? Since there are 500,000 Nepali workers, that's a quarter of the workforce, of the foreign workforce in Qatar. Why doesn't the Labor Ministry of Qatar open a labor office in Kathmandu? And then every person who comes, every Nepali who wants to work in Qatar would come to this labor office in Kathmandu where Nepali and Qatari officials would work together to make sure that there is a contract signed with a salary fixed, with labor conditions provided, and that contract is e-registered immediately in the databases of Qatar. So that the very frequent practice of signing a contract in Kathmandu, which provides for, $1,200 dollars or dinars per month, and then when you arrive in Doha, you're told, no, this was your Nepali contract. Your real contract in Qatar is 800, not 1,200. That is very frequent. And there's nothing that the migrant can do because they have borrowed already to pay for the recruitment fees. And they have to work 1 year, 2 years, sometimes 3 years to repay the debt for the recruitment fees. They cannot go back home and say, oh, I don't want that contract. I want to go back home. Send me home. They have to repay the debt. So they have to work. Even at $800 a month, they have to work now. And so they can't reject the new contract that's given to them. So I suggested, let's have a contract that's already e-registered by the Qatari authorities in Kathmandu to avoid that contract to be torn up when in Doha. Is it realistic to think that this will happen? I don't think so. I think no one who has a voice in the labor market in Qatar has any interest of this happening, because it would increase the cost of labor, and some companies don't want that. And I think there is, whether we like it or not, some collusion between political authorities and business everywhere in the world. And there's big lobbies in favor of employers, and it's very difficult for the little guy to go against that. As long as there's no political will to change that in favor of the little guy, it's going to be difficult.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais balancer en termes de langue et prendre maintenant des questions peut-être de francophones ou d'arabophones.
Très bien. Est-ce que vous voulez que je réponde en français ou
S'il vous
en
plaît,
anglais?
En français, ça vous va?
Absolument.
Alors, j'ai une question en face de moi qui attend depuis un moment, qui brûle depuis un moment. Pareil. Je vous demanderai juste, s'il vous plaît, de nouveau, votre nom et votre pays.
Ben Hadid Samir, Tunisie. Merci, monsieur le professeur, pour votre présentation. Monsieur, vous avez cité tout à l'heure quelques exemples de criminalisation. Alors que dans l'Union européenne, on remarque une tendance générale vers la criminalisation des immigrés irréguliers et de sanctionner les employeurs des travailleurs clandestins. Toutefois, il n'y avait pas de mécanisme pour protéger ces travailleurs. Ma question alors, y a-t-il un plan d'action ou une stratégie pour aider ce genre de travailleurs, surtout ceux qui sont classés dans la catégorie de ni expulsables ni régularisables? Et merci.
Merci. Non, malheureusement, j'ai une question ici et une question là. Alors non, désolé, honneur aux dames.
Bonsoir. السيدة سميرة من المغرب. سوف أطرح سؤالي باللغة العربية. لقد تم وضع برنامج بين الوكالة الوطنية لإنعاش التشغيل والكفاءات ودولة قطر خاص باستقطاب وجلب المغاربة مجانا إلى دولة قطر، وهذا هذه المعلومات على سبيل الإضافة، حيث تم خلق ربط إلكتروني بين وزارة العمل القطرية والوكالة الوطنية لإنعاش التشغيل والكفاءات، يمكن لأرباب العمل أن يضعوا متطلباتهم بهذه الشبكة الإلكترونية، وهناك اتصال يعني دائم يوميا. بخصوص الكفالة أحب أن أوضح وأن الكفالة بالنسبة للسنة الفارطة فقد أزيلت عن العمال المغاربة. دونك ليس هناك، فقد أزيل هذا نظام الكفالة. وشكرا.
Je vais avoir besoin de traduction.
Alors, donc en fait, c'est notre participante de l'ANAPEC qui en fait partageait plus une expérience entre l'ANAPEC et le Qatar, qui ont mis en place en fait une procédure également électronique, et notamment le fait que c'est au niveau des autorités locales que les candidats marocains peuvent présenter leur candidature. Et en fait, elle précise que du coup pour ces travailleurs marocains, le système de la kafala a été aboli. C'est bien ça?
بالإضافة أن هناك تم تشغيل شخص مغربي مكلف بوزارة العمل، يعني تم بعث فتح مكتب مغربي للتشغيل بوزارة العمل القطرية.
Merci. Et en fait, pour précision également, en fait, l'ANAPEC donc, a mis un agent de l'ANAPEC au niveau du Qatar. Donc un agent de l'ANAPEC est présent au niveau du Qatar. Je passe sur la droite. Vous avez une question aussi toujours du...
Oui, merci. Je voudrais moi aussi, permettez-moi d'abord de vous remercier pour votre exposé très riche et très instructif. Je voudrais juste revenir sur l'une des propositions que vous avez citées sur la possibilité de changer le travail pour un immigré ou pour un employé en général qui n'est pas satisfait ou que... Je crois que cette question mérite quand même plus d'approfondissement, plus de réflexion, parce qu'on pense peut-être, je ne sais pas si vous faites allusion à la flexibilité des marchés de travail. Nous savons très bien que le marché de travail, c'est aussi complexe, je dirais, que la migration elle-même. Et la flexibilité au travail, malheureusement, va de pair avec l'insécurité du travail aussi. Il y a toujours cette tangente. Et donc, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un risque là donc, qu'on tombe toujours, en voulant changer, on tombe dans l'insécurité du travail? Merci.
Et juste, tout dernier commentaire, puisque c'était notre représentant des employeurs qui voulait en fait réagir à une de vos interventions. Donc ce sera la dernière personne que je prendrai, et je vous en prie.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to make a comment. The facilitator talked about the fact that workers leave because they're not satisfied or the employer is not treating them well. But then we all know that we leave work for different reasons. I may leave an employer not necessarily because he's not treating me well. I may leave him because maybe I got a better job offer.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify that fact that people leave employment not necessarily because the employer is bad, because from the presentation I get the impression that the employer is being given a very bad rap. It's as though they are all evil and they're all horrible and they are taking advantage of all the poor workers. And we all know it's not like that. I leave an employer because I want, there's a better opportunity. It's not a crime, but that doesn't make me a criminal as an employer either.
No, no.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Merci beaucoup pour ce dernier commentaire. Professeur Crépeau, je vous laisse, il nous reste 10 minutes.
Oui.
Je vous laisse conclure avec ces 3 dernières questions.
Très bien. La question du collègue tunisien, le fait qu'il y a une tendance générale à la criminalisation à l'intérieur de l'Union européenne, il existe une directive sur la sanction contre les employeurs. Cette directive, elle fait partie d'un certain nombre de directives européennes comme ça, qui ne sont mises en œuvre dans aucun pays. La directive existe, mais elle n'est pas mise en œuvre. Les employeurs sont, dans la plupart des pays européens, très peu sanctionnés pour les abus qu'ils peuvent commettre à l'égard des travailleurs migrants, particulièrement des travailleurs migrants temporaires ou des travailleurs migrants en situation irrégulière. Ça n'est pas mis en œuvre parce que le système d'inspection du travail est faible, parce qu'il n'y a pas de volonté politique de se mettre à dos des employeurs qui pourraient abuser, mais aussi parce qu'il n'y a pas de volonté politique d'augmenter les coûts du travail que supposerait une véritable lutte contre les abus. Par exemple, si je prends la tomate italienne ou la fraise québécoise, pour reprendre mes deux exemples, si on arrête de payer 20 € pour 10 heures de travail et qu'on a un salaire minimum normal de 10 € de l'heure, par exemple, ce qui veut dire que pour 10 heures de travail, c'est 100 € au lieu de 20. La tomate italienne va être beaucoup plus chère. Et probablement qu'il y a beaucoup de fermes italiennes qui pourraient faire faillite parce qu'elles ne pourraient pas supporter cette augmentation des coûts du travail. Or, c'est précisément ça que je dis. Il faut que nous commencions à discuter, avoir une conversation sociale sur comment produire de la tomate italienne ou de la fraise québécoise sans exploiter les gens. De la même manière qu'au début du XXe siècle, la question s'est posée de savoir comment produire des voitures, comment produire des trains dans des usines sans exploiter les travailleurs. La même question s'est posée. Ce n'est pas une question nouvelle. Comment est-ce qu'on fait pour rendre des entreprises et des industries compétitives sans exploitation? Ben, ça, c'est quelque chose qu'on a déjà fait dans l'histoire, et c'est possible. Si on considère que le fait de ne pas combattre l'exploitation du travailleur, par exemple de laisser les employeurs payer 20 € pour 10 heures de travail, ben, si on le considère comme une subvention déguisée, de la part de l'État, qui ne fait rien, on a une subvention déguisée sur les coûts du travail. Pourquoi est-ce que nous n'aurions pas plutôt une vraie subvention pour aider les fermes qui veulent traiter les employés correctement et les payer, mettons, 10 € de l'heure ou 8 € de l'heure? On peut discuter du niveau de salaire minimum. Mais certainement, de faire en sorte qu'on fournisse une subvention au coût du travail à ces fermes pour ne pas qu'elles périssent, pour ne pas qu'elles disparaissent. Mais là, c'est une conversation sociale qu'il faut avoir. C'est à propos de nos taxes qu'on parle. Mais il faut qu'on en parle. Tant qu'on n'en parle pas, tant qu'on ne discute pas de ces questions-là, tant qu'il n'y a pas de conversation sociale, il n'y a pas de solution. Et il n'y a aucune volonté politique de faire quoi que ce soit. Donc ça, c'est un premier problème. Alors, à l'égard des ni expulsables ni régularisables, là, je pense qu'il y a un problème de fond. Il y a un problème de fond qui est celui de poser la question de ce que signifie une personne qui vit sur un territoire pendant de très nombreuses années et qui n'a pas possibilité de s'intégrer. Là, je pense qu'il va falloir qu'on réfléchisse à un nouveau droit de l'homme qui est le droit à l'intégration. Si vous avez passé 20 ans dans ce pays et que vous ne pouvez pas être renvoyé dans votre pays d'origine à cause des risques que vous y courriez, eh bien, il me semble qu'on va devoir penser à dire que 20 ans dans le pays, surtout si la personne s'est mariée, a eu des enfants, eh bien, ça devrait conduire à la résidence permanente et ça devrait conduire à la citoyenneté. Parce que la citoyenneté est la seule vraie sécurité pour les migrants. Bien, ça, il me semble que c'est quelque chose auquel il va falloir qu'on réfléchisse. Ce n'est pas dans les agendas pour l'instant, c'est certainement pas dans l'agenda européen à l'heure actuelle, mais c'est quelque chose auquel il va falloir qu'on pense. Parce que ces gens-là vont rester, puisqu'ils ne sont pas expulsables. Et donc, on va faire quoi? Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire de leurs enfants? Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire de leurs petits-enfants? Est-ce que ça va durer comme ça éternellement? Ce n'est pas possible. Il va falloir qu'on pense que ces gens-là, actuellement, en fait, font partie déjà de nous. Et s'ils font partie de nous, il faut qu'on les intègre. Et ça va être c'est un projet, ce ne sera pas fait tout de suite, mais je pense que ça va se faire sur une génération, peut-être 2 générations. Ces choses-là vont petit à petit se faire. On va considérer que si vous n'êtes pas expulsable, eh bien, vous allez faire partie de la communauté, c'est tout. Et on va gérer la situation. La procédure électronique entre le Maroc et le Qatar, moi, ça me paraît excellent. Je suis content de voir que ça existe. J'aimerais que ce genre de procédure puisse fonctionner de façon beaucoup plus systématique. On a vu des situations tout à fait critiques. Alors, vous dites qu'il y a un agent marocain présent au Qatar. L'ambassade des Philippines au Qatar, à Doha, joue un rôle considérable. Ils ont même un dortoir avec 100 lits principalement pour les travailleuses domestiques qui fuient leurs employeurs et qui sont donc déclarés runaway et qui sont immédiatement arrêtables, qui peuvent être détenus en attendant leur expulsion. Eh bien, il y a un dortoir pour les accueillir. Mais ça ne rend pas la situation de ces travailleuses domestiques plus facile, puisqu'il est extrêmement difficile, il est impossible au Qatar, par exemple, d'envoyer l'inspection du travail dans une famille, dans une maison privée. Ça ne se fait pas. Et donc, il est très difficile de détecter les cas d'abus avant que l'abus soit tellement insoutenable que la personne fuit. Et donc là, on a un problème. Ce n'est pas parce qu'il y a un agent sur place, et Dieu sait que l'ambassadeur des Philippines fait un gros effort pour accueillir toutes ces femmes, mais ça ne suffit pas. Alors, c'est là où la volonté politique est importante, et je suis heureux d'entendre que le Maroc a réussi à obtenir un certain nombre de choses. Les Philippines ont réussi à négocier un accord de meilleur traitement de leurs citoyens, et particulièrement de leurs citoyennes, avec l'Arabie Saoudite, il y a 2 ans. Donc, il est possible de négocier des choses, et certains États y arrivent. Je pense qu'il y a un travail à long terme à faire. On m'avait posé la question auparavant des organisations régionales et de la mobilité, de free movement, de la libre circulation des personnes. Moi, je crois que c'est un modèle absolument à développer. Je crois que le modèle de la libre circulation des personnes qui existe dans l'Union européenne, mais qui existe aussi dans le cône sud-américain, autour de l'Argentine, il y a une libre circulation à peu près totale des personnes qui leur permet de s'installer dans le pays de leur choix et de s'inscrire sur le marché du travail. Moi, je pense que ce sont des mécanismes qui sont absolument excellents. Il faut lutter contre les mythes sur le fait que les migrants seraient mauvais pour les économies. Je crois que la mobilité est bonne pour toutes les économies, et plus la mobilité est grande, et plus l'espace territorial sur lequel la mobilité peut agir est grand, plus la mobilité remplit les besoins de l'économie, et plus les employeurs sont capables de trouver les employés avec les compétences dont ils ont besoin, dans le temps dans lequel ils ont besoin. Ça, je pense qu'il va falloir que ça vienne. La question de la flexibilité et de l'insécurité, je pense que la question n'est... La flexibilité, c'est la capacité de l'employeur dans la définition qu'on en a donnée au cours des 20 dernières années, selon les formules du néolibéralisme, etc., c'est la capacité de l'employeur d'ajuster la force de travail en fonction des besoins de son entreprise. Donc, tout d'un coup, on a plus de commandes, on embauche. Tout d'un coup, on a moins de commandes, eh bien, on va mettre à pied toute une partie de la main-d'œuvre, et puis on va les réembaucher, et puis on va les débaucher. Et puis, si tout d'un coup, on a besoin qu'ils travaillent moins d'heures, eh bien, on va les employer pour je sais pas moi, 25 heures semaine au lieu de les employer à temps plein, etc. C'est cette flexibilité qui crée une insécurité parce que c'est la décision de l'employeur. Je pense que ce dont moi je parlais, de cette flexibilité, c'est la capacité pour l'employé aussi d'être capable de choisir son employeur en fonction des contrats qu'on lui offre, en fonction des conditions du marché, en fonction de l'attitude de l'employeur, en fonction de toutes sortes de critères qui sont les siens. Je pense que la flexibilité, si on utilise ce terme de façon absolument générale, n'est pas une mauvaise chose. Les entreprises veulent avoir le nombre d'employés optimal pour réaliser les contrats qu'on a passés avec elles. Mais en même temps, il faut s'assurer que ce ne soit pas arbitraire, d'où tout le travail d'encadrement de l'embauche et de la débauche des employés. Alors, il faut plus de facilité pour que les entreprises soient capables de créer des emplois et de réduire leur force de travail pour répondre aux besoins de l'économie, mais il faut permettre aussi la mobilité aux travailleurs et ne pas, et ça c'est l'exemple que je donnais, du système du travailleur migrant temporaire qui est attaché à un seul employeur, dont qu'il ne peut quitter, que ce soit lui qui soit renvoyé ou lui qui quitte l'employeur pour toutes sortes de raisons, sans devenir immédiatement migrant clandestin et être renvoyable. Je pense que c'est ça, il faut le protéger contre ça. The last intervention, I hope I haven't come across as saying that all employers are evil, because that's certainly not what I've said in my reports. What I'm saying is that every one of us needs a framework. Montesquieu said in the 18th century that power will go until it finds another power to stop it. And that's what we need. That's what we need in our lives, in our daily lives. We know that with the policeman. We know that if there's no policeman on the highway, and the highway is limited at 100 kilometers per hour, and we know that there's never a policeman on that highway, we'll all go more than 100 kilometers per hour. We know that. And we know that if there's a photo radar on that highway, we'll go at 100 kilometers per hour because we don't want to have the fine for going above. So we need that check. And this is a framework that is usually I think, should be negotiated with employers. Employers have to recognize the power that they have over their employees, and many of them don't think they're abusing. Many of them are not abusing them, the employees. Many of them don't think they're abusing even though they're doing it, and many of them are abusing without any shame. And that's especially when the conditions allow it. So what I'm saying is that we have to put a labor law framework that will put limits to the powers of the employer of possibly abusing. The good employer will find that pretty normal because that's what he or she was doing already. But we have to do that, and we have to allow the employee to negotiate with the employer with some power of his or her own. And the capacity, for example, to leave an employer for all sorts of reasons, as you mentioned. For example, there's a better offer. For example, I'm a domestic worker. I'm paid, I'm working 50 hours a week. I'm paid $8 per hour, and the neighbor is offering me $10 per hour. That's a good reason, because I can send more money to my family back home. And migrant workers should be able to do that in the same way as any of us. If we have another employer who likes what we're doing and is offering us, 20% more salary to go and work with him or her, well, that's an offer that we're going to think about. We think it's normal that we be offered, as much money as possible for the kind of work we do. And if someone offers more, well, we might go with that employer because he values the work we do more and we think it's a good thing. Well, domestic workers or construction workers should be able to do the same. If another company offers better conditions because they like the kind of work that this domestic worker does, because she has seen, for example, the domestic worker with the kids and likes the kind of interaction that this domestic worker has with the children, that person might say, okay, I want you because you're good. I'm going to offer you $2 more per hour. Why not? That person should be able to choose. At present, under the employer-specific contracts that exist under the kafala system, but also in Canada and Australia and many other countries, they can't. And many employers know that, know that limitation in their power. And some of them are abusing it. Some of them are abusing it without thinking they're abusing it. So that's where the legal framework is important. Labor law, the national labor law, has to put a framework where there is a balance of power that will allow both parties to have enough power not to be abused. That's the point of labor law. It takes time, it takes goodwill, but it takes political will. And at present, regarding migrant workers, there's no political will because there's no electoral advantage. And to me, that is precisely the problem. I haven't been able to explain fully why this political will is not there, but I've explained that there's no electoral advantage. And to me, that's a very important point.
Merci énormément. On va encore énormément de questions, mais on ne sera malheureusement pas en mesure de les prendre. J'aimerais remercier les interprètes parce qu'on n'a même pas fait de pause. Merci beaucoup. Désolée pour vous avoir skippé la pause des interprètes. À vous aussi, en fait, puisque finalement, vous avez tenu pendant 2h30. Ça a été une session, je pense, énormément appréciée. Énormément de questions ont été posées. J'ai une toute dernière faveur, professeur Crépeau, à vous demander. Certains participants m'ont demandé s'ils pouvaient faire une photo avec vous, même si c'est avec... Alors, j'aimerais demander aux participants qui aimeraient être sur la photo de venir à l'avant pour qu'on puisse prendre la photo.
Volontiers.
Bon, c'est une photo par WC, mais bon, au moins, quand même, vous serez sur la photo. S'il vous plaît, par contre, avancez, parce que...
Oui. Par contre, je suis sûr qu'avec l'enregistrement que vous avez peut-être de cette vidéoconférence et avec Photoshop, vous pouvez faire quelque chose de très bien, comme si j'étais dans la pièce.
Exactement. Merci, je vous enverrai la photo. Merci encore beaucoup, passez une très bonne journée. Encore 1000 merci pour être venu avec nous aujourd'hui.
Ça fait
Et
un
bonne
grand plaisir.
continuation. Merci beaucoup.
À bientôt,
Au revoir.
au revoir.